Ok, buongiorno a tutti. Oggi siamo qua, abbiamo il piacere di aver con noi il professor Neil Theise, docente dell'Università di New York di medicina, ricercatore di livello internazionale e soprattutto, sarà l'argomento di cui parleremo con lui oggi, autore di un fantastico libro appena uscito dal titolo Notes of Complexity, che è questo. E è un piacere averlo qui con noi, so thank you so much for your time with us.
Oh,
And
thank you so much for yours.
yeah, dear Dr. Tease. And well, first of all, I read your book and I found it amazing. And something unexpected for me because yeah, I had a different idea of what it could be a book written by you. So the first question is what is your book about? Because the title, not of complexity, you know,
It's about
is not
everything.
enough to define your book. So please let us know
Sure.
what is your book about.
So, it's about everything. It's about the nature of existence, the nature of life, and the nature of the universe. Um, Complexity theory is it's related in some ways to chaos theory, which I think people have heard about chaos theory and fractal geometries. These are things fairly well known in the popular culture. Complexity theory is what came next. And it was complexity theory that allowed scientists and mathematicians and modelers, computer modelers, to come to understand the nature of life. So we think of biology as the science of life, but it's really the science of living things. Complexity theory takes a step back, and instead of biology, which pulls things into pieces and we see what organs there are inside and what tissues there are inside, and we have cellular biology and molecular biology, these are all the reductionist approaches of traditional biology. Complexity theory considers how, when you put all these pieces together, they organize themselves into something much bigger than you might expect. You take the pieces of a clock and you put them together, and you always get exactly a clock. But you put cells together, and you get really interesting, unpredictable things that you can't understand by looking simply at just the cells themselves. The way you could, in principle, look at a clock, and without putting it together, you could say, oh, these will become a clock when I put them together. But you look at cells, you have no idea what they're going to become. You look at people, you have no idea what they're going to become. And so that's what complexity theory covers. And as a result, it's sort of, as I would say it's the third major science to arise out of the major theory to arise out of 20th century science. The first is quantum physics. The second is relativity. And complexity is the third. Quantum physics covers everything at the smallest levels of scale in the universe and is very difficult to understand because it is not anything like our day-to-day life. And relativity covers the largest scales of existence, which are so beyond our everyday existence. We seem to disappear when we consider things at the scale of relativity. Complexity is what takes you from quantum mechanics through our everyday world and our everyday lives up to the universe as a whole. And so I think it's the missing piece. And the book is my attempt to introduce people in a simple way, as simply as possible, in a short way. It's not a long book, to understand the world we live in and the nature of our bodies and our place in existence.
Yeah, thank you. And well, because the second question was, but you already answered in such a way, was why this book? Why at a certain point of your life do you decide to say, okay, at this point, I would like to say something about that?
Sure.
And why now?
Yeah. These ideas have been cooking in my head for a little more than 20 years. I first learned about complexity theory. I tell the story in the beginning of the book. I was doing stem cell research, stem cell biology, that came out of my clinical practice. I'm a liver pathologist, which means I sit at a microscope and I look at slides all day, and in a hospital. And out of my clinical work, I had developed some scientific work regarding stem cells. And so around the year 2000, the turn of the millennium, New York City, yeah. An unpredictable complex system. Welcome to my home. So I was doing stem cell biology, and around 2000, my research team was part of the general stem cell explosion that happened back then. We were doing adult stem cells and how adult stem cells can become any cell in the human body, essentially. And as a result of that work, which became very well known, it was the first research I ever did that sort of went viral in the media. I was introduced to an artist named Jane Prophet, and she had been doing pieces of artistic work that looked at virtual environments in a computer and how people would respond to their own virtual creatures that they would set up and send out into this world that she called technosphere. And because of that, she had learned about principles of artificial life, which are really the principles of complexity theory. And when she and I were speaking with each other, I told her about how stem cells move in the body. And she says to me that that's very much like how complexity theory people talk about how ants organize into colonies. And suddenly complexity theory entered my life and then sort of exploded it. And as I continued to explore how, if ants self-organize into colonies is similar to how cells self-organize into bodies, including the body of an ant, then you have this funny thing of a complex system made of a complex system. And over the next couple of decades, well, our cells, this fundamental unit of reality, Western medicine and Western biology say yes, they're based on cell doctrine, that all living things are made of cells and that all cells come from other cells. But cells themselves at the molecular level, there's no cell there. They're just molecules floating in water. And so are molecules a fundamental unit of life? Well, no, they're just made up of atoms, and those are made up of subatomic particles and blah, blah, blah. We're all the way down in the quantum realm. And suddenly complexity theory opens up a whole realm of philosophy and metaphysics that very quickly aligned with my Zen Buddhist practice, because I'm what might call a spiritual person. I grew up Jewish and have a Jewish practice. Then I added on a meditation practice from Zen Buddhism, which I've been doing for 35 years. And suddenly the science of complexity was showing me principles of Buddhist metaphysics and Jewish mysticism. And I started giving talks on this, first in academic groups and in my Zen Buddhist group. And then wider and wider groups of artists, grad students in cell biology. My nephew's 5th grade class at school wanted to hear about this. And so I've been giving these talks for 20 years. And finally, I had actually wanted to write a book about the last few years of my mother's life, which was kind of remarkable in a lot of ways. And I got an agent and a book proposal and some interested publishers, but they said, well, before we want to hear about your mother, we want to hear who you are, why we'd want to hear about your mother. And some of them went online and saw these talks, because there's lots of them on YouTube. And they were like, oh, you have to write that book first. So why now? I wanted to write the book about my mother.
They decide for you, yeah.
Yeah. And they said, no, you got to do this. But The funny thing is that when I finished writing this book, it took about a year and a half to actually write the whole thing. Nearly 2 years. I didn't realize that what I was writing was a book about my whole life, because the information I've collected over since I was a kid, all of it was necessary to put this all together. And whether it was about physics, I was reading particle physics when I was in 7th grade, and Einstein was my hero when I was growing up. That's in the book. My medical school studies are in the book. I thought about going to rabbinical school when I was in college and majored in biblical studies. That's in the book.
Yeah. This brings me back to the first question. What is about the book? Is it really about complexity or about something else? Because as a reader of your book, I can say that, in my opinion, your book talks about three different stuff. The first about complexity, the second about yourself, and the fourth different style. The third about history of science.
Yeah.
And the fourth, probably the most important part, about consciousness. And consciousness with the C major. And you decide to mash up all this in a book. And it's really interesting. Now I have a personal question for you.
Sure.
During your teaching, in medical school, how can you mash up your Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde part, the spiritual one and the real researcher, evidence-based medicine focus one? Because I would like in my life to attend one of your lectures at medical school, if you are able to make make possible to learn for students how the model we decide to have all together of the evidence base sometimes is not the only one. I can only imagine how it can be difficult to mash up this stuff. Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, this is the interesting thing. It turns out not to be difficult at all. If it were difficult, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Yeah.
It had to be relatively simple, though it's surprising. So, in general, when I'm asked to teach medical students, it's to teach them liver pathology. And so I'm giving them category of diseases and stuff like that. If they get a sense of something more, it's because of me and the way I talk about things. But I think a good example of what you're talking about, so, normally I'm not talking complexity theory to medical students. The curriculum is extremely tight, and they have to learn these many diseases and these many treatments and these many drugs by this date, and they have to pass their exams, so there's no time to breathe. But one time I was invited to give a talk on stem cell biology, to my perspective on adult stem cell plasticity, this ability of adult cells to do crazy things, unexpected things. And the person inviting me was an old friend of mine, and I asked her for permission to teach in a slightly different way than normal. It was a group of about 30 graduate students in biology, most of them doing stem cell research. And therefore, most of them what I'd call hardcore materialists. They're growing up in a Western tradition. They're studying cell biology. And we talk about tissue engineering, and cells are building blocks of life. And this makes it sound like bodies are machines. And that's our dominant cultural model. When you talk about going to see the doctor, did they fix you? Like you're a car. And I wanted to try something a little different. And I knew that most of these students would be suspicious. but I just wanted to try. So instead of talking about religion, I started the lecture telling them, discussing how they all probably have reasons for going into a PhD program or an MD PhD program to do biological or medical research. They want to win a Nobel Prize. They want to cure cancer. They all have reasons or goals. But I wanted to suggest to them that before they became interested in these kinds of goals, in the early years of their lives, when they were already starting to think about being scientists, that their interests when they were children were in the sciences, that itself, if you go further back, came out of some sort of feeling of connection with the world, a feeling of being connected and a curiosity that comes, that arises because you feel part of this world. What is this world? And starting to explore this when you're 3 or 4 years old or 5 years old, the first time you see ants are always such a good way to explain complexity theory, how ants interact with each other to create these colonies that no one is planning. There's no ant in charge. When we're 4 or 5 years old and you come upon ants for the first time, every kid is amazed because they watch it happening. So I said to them that instead of giving a straightforward lecture, I wanted to try and bring them back to this sense of who they were when they were 3 years old or 4 years old. And so the way the book is organized, if your listeners go get a copy and open it up, we start with complexity theory at the everyday scale, you and me as separate human beings. And then we go down to the microscopic scale to look at how cells, that bodies don't exist, they're simply self-organizing cells. The way an ant colony doesn't exist, it's actually just as a thing, it's just self-organizing ants. And at the cellular level, where the notion of your boundary changes. At the everyday scale, your boundary is the skin, or in this case, our computer screens. But at the cellular level, your microbiome is interwoven with the entire environment all around you, and you're exchanging microbiomes with people all the time. You share a single microbiome with people with whom you live and people with whom you work. And at the molecular level, the cells disappear and your boundaries become wider because your molecules are going out into the world, such as carbon dioxide for the plants, and then their molecules are coming into your bodies. So at the molecular level, we're wider. At the atomic level, there's no atom in our bodies that we didn't drink, eat, or breathe from the planet. So everyday scale, we're these lonely beings struggling, walking around on this rock we call planet Earth. But at the atomic level, we are the atomic substance of the Earth that has taken 3.5 billion years to self-organize into something that thinks of themselves as separate and alone. So these different views. So instead of just giving the information in a lecture or like I do in the book, I would stop at each point, ask the students to sit up in their chairs, close their eyes, focus on their breathing, and then imagine their bodies at the everyday scale. Then bring their imagination to cells in their body moving around. Then bring their imagination to molecules and their connection to the world around them and to the atomic scale and to the quantum scale. And when I first started doing this, they're all sitting there with their arms crossed and their legs are crossed and they're looking like, what kind of lecture is this? By the end, everybody had relaxed. And I didn't have to say we're doing something spiritual. But many people, if not most people, I'd like to think everyone in the room got a little bit of a taste of who they were when they were 4 years old and encountering the world without judgment or categories or assumptions or ambitions that were about their tight little selves. They were just being in the world. A few students came up to me after the talk and were appreciative. More students who were afraid to come up to me after the talk probably sent me emails. And so this is the thing, that the complexity theory ideas, they work well as concepts, but it also gives you a framework for changing your experience of the world as you move through it. And I think you've probably experienced from reading the book, it's hard to go outside now and look at birds flying by, or look at buds on trees, or children in a playground, or traffic going down the highway, and not be aware that you're part of a complex system and what that means. You can't unsee it once you've seen it. And so it becomes a book about experience as much as a book about facts and science.
Thank you, Neil. And there was a couple of words that touch my in such a way my soul about your book, because they remind me to when I was very young. The first one is Gaia. You know, I was a really great fan of Isaac Asimov. You know,
Right.
yeah. And
me too.
yeah, and he reminded me to the Foundation Saga, in which at a certain point this space cowboy arrived in Gaia. And there were people that talk as themselves and as Gaia.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, and probably, and the other word was divergent. You know, there's a saga now of movies and of novels like this. And would you like to talk a little bit about these two concepts in your book?
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny you mentioned Isaac Asimov and Foundation, because the core idea there was this character named Harry Seldon had this little device, and he could punch in things and he could tell you the future course of human history.
Yeah, right.
And when I was a teenager, I read that, and I started studying the works of Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee, because I thought maybe their concepts could lead to that. And I had, 6 months where I was imagining maybe I can invent Harry Seldon's view of. And what I now know is that history arising from human interactions is a complex system and always has some degree of randomness in the system, which means it can't ever be predicted. Yeah. So the very foundations of the Foundation trilogy are false. And I wish Isaac Asimov was around so I could have that conversation.
Psycho story, you know, they call it psycho story.
Psychohistory.
Right.
But Gaia, this was a concept that came up, I think, in the 60s, maybe. I'd have to look up the date in my book.
Yeah, something about that.
James Lovelock and Margulies. I'm blocking on her first name. I know her, actually. And Lynn Margulies. This is just being old. And the decline in one's, that's all complex systems theory too, as you know. But they came up with this concept that the Earth as a whole is a single unitary living being. And Lovelock chose the name Gaia, a Greek Earth Mother goddess. And it was disparaged for a very long time by many people in Orthodox scientific communities. But bit by bit, through his work and Lynn's work, they demonstrated that it is a reasonable point of view. And they were doing this before complexity theory had actually established itself with its principles and its own authority. But exactly what I said of us at the atomic level, you can look at us as, every living thing on Earth being a separate little unit that we could study in a scientific way. And thus to look at Earth as a single living organism, it's multitudes of organisms. So how can you say it's a single organism? But at the atomic scale, there is no discontinuity between us and the planet. There's no discontinuity between us and every other living thing. You know, another example of this, which I go into in the book, a little exercise, and you can do this. I've done this as a guided meditation as well. But if you think about what your body is this morning, in my case, it's morning, and what my body was yesterday and my body last week and last year, I think of this as my body. And I can imagine my body as the body of when I was an adolescent, a teenager, and that's my body. But it's a completely different body. Most of its physical substance has completely changed over. And because of cell doctrine, every cell in this body derived from a cell in that body. And every cell in my adolescent body derived from every cell in my child body, in my neonatal body, in the 9-month-old fetus I was before I was born, to the embryo I was that arose out of my father's sperm and my mother's egg. And my mother's egg came directly from her body, with no discontinuities between her body and what would become my body. In fact, when she was born, she already had the egg that would become me inside her, as she was coming out of her mother's body, and her mother's before her. And if you go back far enough, you're no longer Homo sapiens, you're Homo erectus, and then you're Homo habilis, and then you're early mammals, and then you're something called synapsids, all the way back. And as far as we can tell, all living things on Earth derive from a single cell. All living things share basic genetic material that indicates we are one single unified being. And in the same way that this body is shedding cells all the time and regenerating new cells, life on Earth as a single body has been doing that too. So to say that the Earth can't be Gaia because we're individuals, you're missing half the point. We are also a single living organism that thinks of ourselves as special, but the generations die off the way our skin sheds cells. So there's no difference. This brings up an important concept, and it may be one of the most important concepts in the book for me, called complementarity. This idea that I have a standard diagram in the book, which I'm sure everyone watching this program has seen. You have two faces looking at each other in silhouette, and the space. Yep.
Yeah, go ahead. No problem. I will find it.
You find it, okay. And the space between the faces looks like a vase. If you say that it's a picture of two faces, you're missing the vase. If you say that it's a picture of a vase, you're missing the two faces. They're a complementarity. The truth is both are true, always, equally. Neither can be privileged over the other, but you can only see one or the other at a single time. And in the same way, we are separate individuals, separate beings walking around, having our lives. And at the same time, equally in complementarity, we are tiny parts of a much larger whole. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, it is this, right?
Yeah, so is it two faces or is it a vase? It's both. So we live in a world of, and from complexity theory standpoint, since the entire universe, as I work my way towards demonstrating in the book, is one giant complex system. Any of these points of view is an incomplete picture. We are both our separate selves. We are Gaia. We are both our separate selves, and we are the entire universe. which has self-organized itself into galactic structures and galaxies and solar systems and planets with living things on them. We assume at least one, probably more. So again, it's sort of complexity very quickly leads from the science, and before you know it, you're talking about philosophical things and metaphysical things. And why shouldn't we? A comprehensive theory of existence has to be able to explain both. Otherwise, you're missing the vase, or you're missing the faces.
Yeah, right.
But I have to say, a disclaimer is that I was not, while I have, I've had spiritual practices and interests for my whole life, and I've had my scientific ones, I never had any interest in trying to bring them together. I didn't see there to be any sort of need. And our culture is sort of obsessed with, well, how can you be spiritual if you're a scientist? Or how can you be a scientist if you're spiritual? And to me, it's just like, well, I'm a Gemini, so I did both. The fact that the complexity theory, starting from the science, came around and led me to my spiritual practice from the other side was a complete shock to me. And that's when I realized this was something worth talking about publicly, not just in the academic domain. And this is where I started practicing speaking about these things, which could eventually, otherwise this book would have been like 500 pages of dense complexity science, and I never would have gotten to consciousness.
Yeah, right.
The other word, divergent, that you...
Divergent, yeah, right.
Yeah, this is important because, as I already mentioned, in complexity, there has to be randomness in every complex system. And in the example I use in the book, it's my favorite 2 pages in the book, actually, because of the illustrations. How ants form a food line. It looks like someone directed them, take this sugar cube all the way back to the colony, and then come back for more until it's gone. And so it looks like someone organized it, but they didn't. And in fact, the food line forms from the way ants lay down different scent trails, chemical scents, pheromones, when they meet food, when they turn around to carry it back, when they no longer have food, when they encounter some other ant carrying food. All these signals build the line. But when you look down closely, you see that there are always some ants that aren't following the line. 3 to 4%. It turns out that if you computer model ant food lines, if you put an obstruction, like if you step your foot in the middle of a food line, very rapidly the ants form the most efficient line around your foot. But it isn't because someone planned it, and it isn't because the ants in the food line started to do this. It's because the ants not following the line are the ones that rapidly find the route around the foot. Or a more obvious example is what happens when the sugar cube is gone. There have to be some other ants randomly wandering around in the hopes that they'll bump into some food source. Without them, end of sugar cube, end of ant colony. But those 3-4% of the ants are the likely ones to find the food source because they're wandering around. But the moment they do, they become part of a line. And they cease being divergent ants and become the food line themselves. So the low-level unpredictability or randomness in any complex system is necessary for the complex system to adapt and change in a creative kind of way. Right. And one of my favorite phrases from this, I hope it translates well into Italian, Stuart Kauffman, who's one of the founders of complexity theory, talks about how you can't have a huge amount of randomness and unpredictability because then there will be no food line. The ants will just be wandering around. It's anarchy. But there can't be too little, because if there's too little, then there's no freedom in the organization to change if the environment changes, like if the food source runs out, or if a foot steps in the middle of the line, or another ant colony sets up shop over there and challenges it. So you need this area of quench disorder, low-level random. And the result of that is that around each possible moment, if you think about the organization of any complex system, whether it's the cells in a body, ants in a colony, humans in a city or an economy, at every moment, there's a limited array of possibilities, what he calls the adjacent possibles. They're all the possible ways the ant colony could organize in the next moment. It's not an infinite array, because that would be anarchy. But it's not decidable either. It's not 4 or 5 like a machine where you could say, oh, there are predictable paths. So they're the adjacent possibles. And in the next moment, one of those adjacent possibles becomes the next moment, and a whole new cloud of adjacent possibles arises. So this is why Harry Seldon was wrong. There can't be something like psychohistory. Psychohistory could predict the array of the adjacent possibles, but it could never predict which adjacent possible.
Which one of the possibilities. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And so, and the concept of the divergent ants, and a lot of people, and I, you know, when I read about this, I thought, oh, this is like the artists or the musicians or the poets in a society, which is true, except that the divergent ant always winds up being part of the structure, and the other ants, everyone gets a chance to be a divergent ant
at a certain point. Yeah.
Yeah. And you never even know whether you're being a divergent ant or not. You know, if you try too hard, you'll probably miss it.
Yeah. Thank you, Neil. I have couple of more questions. The first one is, you know, in the osteopathic world, you are famous for your discovery of interstitium, you know, of the interstitium.
Well, our re-understanding of
the re-understanding of that. And what you can say, if you would like to say something of the complexity model related to interstitium.
I'm still struggling to how to put these two together in the same talk. But I think I'm finding.
You will come to Italy could be a good topic for your.
Oh yeah. It could definitely be a good topic. So what we've found is what we've contributed to the field is the anatomy that underlies the fact that there is this vast fluid compartment running through all connective tissues of the body, all the fascia of the body, if you want to use that word, although that's too limiting, but that's a separate discussion.
Yeah. No problem.
Language is a problem.
Don't go inside that.
Yeah. But all these fluid channels through the body, it's 25% estimated of the fluid volume of the body. It's 4 times the size of the cardiovascular system, and it crosses all tissue and organ boundaries, in and out of the skull. The entire body is linked by this fluid network. And the osteopaths and the people doing cranial sacral work and Rolfing all have had an intuitive or an actual tactile, physical, emotional sense of this in a way that allopathic trained Western physicians have not. Though colleagues in China said to me that, yeah, but they've been doing this for thousands of years, not just decades, like all of you. But nonetheless, so what I think we thought that let me back up. If you have a large enough multicellular organism, one of the principles of complexity theory is that the more cells you have, the more potential for complexity. And the more diversity of interactions you have, the greater the complexity that can arise. But when you have a large multicellular organism, how do you diversify the interactions between cells that are so far apart? We've assumed that the nervous system and the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system were sufficient for creating the array of diversity of cellular interactions and tissue interactions and molecular interactions to account for the body. But it turns out we were wrong. And the interstitium is a much larger array of potentials for interactivity between vastly separated, what seem like vastly separated parts of a large multicellular organism. So this has a couple of implications. Number one, we can go back in the evolutionary tree and look to see at what level of multicellularity, of what level of size of an organism do you need to start to have an interstitium?
Well, Neil, sorry, but probably in the beginning, because the interstitium brings me back to the imagine of the morula in the embryo.
Well, and then so this becomes an interesting conversation with Jaap van der Wal. But the thing is that initially there's no interstitium, there's just the ball of cells.
Of course,
right?
Of course, yes.
So somewhere there's that transition, and this is what Jaap talks about, very much so. But evolutionarily, you can look at this too. And it's easier to look at a hydra in a dish, for example, than it is an embryo in a dish, if you, in some ways. I have a friend doing hydra research, so I'm pushing her to look for interstitium in hydra. But so I think that, and what that highlights is that this principle of complexity, that the diversity of interactions, that all things are arising out of the interactions of the individual parts. Well, there is some sort of domain within which interactions happen. In ant colonies, it's the physical space of the ant colony in which pheromone signals are being laid down. So there's a community level, a social interstitium. There's a woman named Jennifer Brandel in Chicago, who, when she first read my interstitium work, thought this is what she's seeing when she works with communities and organizations that are trying to come up with creative ways to respond to challenging situations. And so in reading my interstitium papers, not my complexity work, but my interstitium work, she thought that the interstitium provides a language to describe social interactions too. And the result is that some of her principles that were informed by my interstitium work were used to give Chicago one of the best COVID responses in the US. And she told me, I saw this on the front page of the New York Times a couple of months ago, that Japan was reorganizing how they were going to work with their economic system to a different model. And the model is from her group.
Oh,
that
wow.
To some extent comes from our interstitium work, she tells me. So I think all complex systems, we might say all complex systems have a domain within which the interactions take place, and that's the interstitium, perhaps, of a complex system. That's the most precise I've been about it so far.
So far.
I haven't said this to anyone until now. So I haven't written this down.
This is the first time.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. How, now the last question, Neil. It's time to talk about consciousness with the C major. No, please. And I would like to talk about that from the osteopathic point of view. You know that especially when you start with a cranial treatment or something more related to what now someone called biodynamics, or anyway, an indirect approach on the body, at a certain point, as you describe in your book, you arrive to have a sort of plug-in with something else that is probably what you define as consciousness with the C major. My question is, why, in your personal opinion, this consciousness with the C major, the capital C, can help us, because it is true during each treatment for us, to treat patients? Because you know, in a lot of osteopathic books, we just to give you a name, Rollin Becker said that our work is just to activate a system and then someone else start to work for us. And probably this is related to the consciousness with with the capital C. Yeah. And I would like your opinion about that.
So now I'm going to say something I haven't thought of before or said before.
And this is the second.
Completely off the top of my mind. Consciousness is the interstitium of existence, as well as the substance of existence. What I mean by this is Western science and Western philosophy have a limited range of possible explanations for what our conscious minds are. Small c consciousness, my mind, my consciousness, my experience. The most common one in our culture is, and the reason the book takes a turn towards consciousness is I realized two things. One, my model of understanding the whole universe as a complex system, from quantum physics all the way up to the universal scale, left out anything about consciousness, which to humans at least, it's the most important thing about us. So I was missing something. Second is that two of the three leading ways of explaining scientifically what our conscious minds are based on complexity, even though they turn out to be wrong, I think. And I think you would think so too.
Yeah.
So the first is that the brain makes our minds. And in complexity terms, just as you can't predict the emergent properties, the structures of the ant colony, or the structures of a human society, or the structures of a specific tissue based on looking at the cells because of randomness, etc. It's almost magic how the colony arises. In the same way, it's almost magic how out of the substance of the brain, its cells, its pathways, its chemicals, its electrical signaling, out of those things interacting at the local scale, you get the human mind. But the problem is that doesn't explain, it explains how you see, the classic example is the red of a rose. Light bounces off the rose, comes into our eye, hits cells in the retina. Red light causes this particular chemical sequence, which leads to an electrical signal to the back of your brain, and your visual cortex lights up, and you have the experience of a rose. The problem is if you close your eyes, you can see the red of the rose. You have the experience of the red of the rose, and there's no light, there are no cells there. So the materialist view that the brain gives rise to the mind, you know, it's not a perfect example, but it gives a flavor of how cognitive neuroscience, no matter how much they map the dynamic activities of the brain, they can only ever speak of neural correlates of consciousness. They can say that when you have this experience, the brain is doing this, but they can't say that it causes the experience.
Well, yeah.
So far, the materialist view is not explanatory for consciousness because it can't explain the experience. Some people say, no, in 10 years, we'll be able to figure it out. So there's a famous bet that keeps being pushed down the line that, no, soon we'll be able to do it. There are other people who say, this is a panpsychist point of view, that consciousness is inherent in the universe. Some people will say any living cell, any living thing, meaning a cell, is inherently conscious, a proto-consciousness that when it combines into larger structures of consciousness, you get a human mind. So it's like complexity. Small little interacting bits of consciousness give rise to our own minds. But that doesn't solve the hard problem of consciousness, how you have the experience of it. Some people will say that subatomic particles convey or carry consciousness. Some people say the structures of space-time convey consciousness. These are the panpsychist models. But these don't explain the hard problem of consciousness. The third possibility, which is central to Western philosophy, Plato, Spinoza, Leibniz, actually, as a complementary approach to Spinoza, you might say, Kant, Hegel, as well as cultural traditions of the mind, exploring the mind itself in contemplative practices, whether it's a Catholic mystic in a monastery or a Zen monk up on a mountaintop. They're all using their minds to explore their minds. What these philosophers and these religious practitioners experience is the mind comes first. And this is, in fact, what quantum physics has to say. Most of the founders of quantum physics, all but Einstein, came to the conclusion that quantum physics implies that consciousness comes first, and the specific nature of reality arises from that. You can even argue that relativity does that. And I argue in the book that complexity theory does that. And so where I come to land is that consciousness, big C consciousness, a universal fundamental awareness in which there are no distinctions between subject and object. There are no separations. There is no definition of self and other. That's the ground out of which everything arises. In which case, why is it that the osteopath might say that big C consciousness is where things are happening? Maybe it's because they're giving in their notions of self that we're raised with, as I stop at the skin, are giving way. When they come into proximity, or maybe not necessarily physical proximity even, of their patients, the boundaries start to fall away. There are no boundaries. It's a method of training practitioners and healers to see the two faces instead of the vase, the fundamental nature of reality in which we are just undifferentiated consciousness in one single, simple, uninterrupted, unified sphere. And somehow, in so perceiving things, it clears the way for the rigid, reified body of the person with whom you're working to also give way into what lies below. There are no interactions that can take place outside of consciousness if consciousness is everything. So that in that way, consciousness is sort of the interstitium. But at the same time, consciousness is every part as well. But this is non-dual reality. There is no separation between self and other. When there is differentiation into self and other, then there has to be an interstitium between them. Ooh.
Great.
Brand new. Maybe this will be my talk in Milan next year.
Okay. Neil, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. And I guess that a lot of Italian osteopaths have the opportunity to read your book as I did, because it was really, 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 really interesting for me. Okay.
And I really look forward, if anyone knows any publishers. So far it's being translated into Hungarian, Japanese, Mandarin, and Korean. So, but not in Italian. So
we could try to do that. I can't promise, but we could try. Okay.
You never know what happens.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.